Okay, good morning, everyone. I am Lisa Sowle Cahill. I am from Boston College, where I am a professor of theology and ethics. I welcome all of our participants to the session this morning, which is on the ethics of nonviolence, peacebuilding, and war. And especially, we're going to look at some future challenges and some conceptions of just war and peacebuilding that we are considering, or in the middle of, maybe I should say, today. So first of all, let me introduce our four speakers. The first one is Pat Gaffney. She has been the General Secretary of Pax Christi, England and Wales for almost 30 years and recently stepped down from that position. She's also a very active and well-known educator, campaigner, and advocator of nonviolent peacebuilding. And her work has taken her to places like East Timor, Russia, and Israel-Palestine. She shared these experiences through many publications, articles, teaching resources, talks, and workshops. She is also now a member of the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative Executive Committee. Secondly, we have with us retired Major General of the U.S. Air Force, Robert Latiff. He is now a consultant providing advice to corporations, universities, and government agencies. He's an adjunct faculty member at the University of Notre Dame and a research professor at George Mason University. He's a member of the Committee on International Security and Arms Control of the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. He has several books and is working on still more. And I will mention one that came out just this year, Future Peace, Technology, Aggression, and the Rush to War. Professor Rashied Omar is a teaching professor of Islamic Studies and Peacebuilding at Notre Dame and the Keough School of Global Affairs. Within that, the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. He also serves in Cape Town, South Africa, from which he is joining us today as the imam at the Claremont Main Road Mosque in Cape Town. He's a trustee of the Healing of Memories Institute in South Africa, and the focus of his research is the roots of religious violence and the potential of religion for constructive social engagement. Joining us actually from Lviv in Ukraine is Pavlo Smytsnyuk, who is the director of the Institute of Ecumenical Studies and a senior lecturer at the Ukrainian Catholic University. He's leading a project at the Institute on ecumenism and peacebuilding. And even as we meet today, he's preparing later today and ongoing to present webinars and conferences on peacebuilding in the context of the military conflict in Ukraine. So welcome to all of you. Welcome to our participants. And we're hoping that this panel can be, somewhat interactive and free-flowing. So that's why we are all on the screen at once. And I'm going to be posing some questions, but we'll kind of let this go where it goes naturally. Oh, excuse me, I must back up for a minute. We had a planned participant, Alessio Pecorario, who is a senior official at the Vatican Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development. And unfortunately, he was not able to join us today because of a health challenge. So we wish him the best, and we hope we'll be meeting with him at some future point. So let me then return to the content and the game plan of the webinar. So I'm going to just start out by asking what is a very basic question, maybe something that will be difficult to answer precisely, but one on which I'm sure all of our participants have views. And the general question is, where is the church, or where should the church be, the Catholic Church, on peacebuilding? So yesterday, in his address to this conference, Archbishop Caccia, who's the Vatican's permanent observer to the UN, gave a speech in which he pointed out to all of us that the world right now is facing the highest number of violent conflicts since 1945. And some of the ones that he mentioned specifically are the many across Africa, but also Syria, Yemen, and Myanmar. In addition, he said of great international concern is the buildup of nuclear weapons. And yet he also said that peace building is recognized by the UN today as a solution to some of these challenges, as well as, of course, by the Roman Catholic Church and the World Council of Churches. Turning to Pope Francis. So we have a provocative and interesting array of remarks recently, which to me actually reflects some of the ambiguities and dilemmas in the whole question of use of violence and nonviolence itself. Not to speak for our panelists, but I will just share with you 3 little snippets of commentary that Pope Francis himself has given. So first of all, in his encyclical Fratelli Tutti from 2020, he said that today it's very difficult to invoke rational criteria, or so they were seen, elaborated in earlier centuries to speak of the possibility of a just war. And he repeats something that Pope John Paul II also said, never again war. In March, however, in talking to Russian Orthodox Patriarch Kirill, he added that wars are always unjust and war is never the way. So that's a very strong sentiment that we're getting from Pope Francis. Nevertheless, also last March of this year, in a talk to some editors of Jesuit journals, he did, while still exhorting everyone to nonviolence, added that the Ukrainians, among others perhaps, do have a right to defend themselves. So the dilemma or the complexity, I suppose, is where does self-defense, other uses of violence, even if violence can never be fully justified because it always results in injustice, okay, that the process of violent exchange is never completely just. But what do we say to situations like the situation in Ukraine or Myanmar, Syria, Yemen, the other places that Archbishop Katya mentioned? And I'm going to turn first on this question to Pat Gaffney, because she has for decades really represented the nonviolent stance and message of Catholicism. So maybe we could just put that out on the table first, of course, allowing you to add any other, qualifications and developments that you want to, Pat. But please share with us some responses.
Thank you very much. And it's great to be part of this from the other side of the world, especially. As a member of the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative and someone with 30 years experience of Pax Christi, which is an international movement, I just want to reflect a little bit on how I see what Francis has been inviting us into for the last few years. And I think since 2016, when we gathered in Rome for the first conference on nonviolence, right up to the present moment, we've seen Pope Francis using World Peace Day messages. We've seen through Laudato Si, through Fratelli Tutti, and numerous Angelus messages, that first of all, Francis is looking at the issue of violence as a much wider thing than simply warfare. And I know today we're looking very much at the context of Ukraine, but I think it's important to draw it back. So Francis is looking at violence in terms of war, but also economic violence, structural violence, the violence of racism, what we're doing to the environment as an act of violence. So Francis is talking in a very interconnected way, I think. And that to me is rather important in trying to understand maybe where he's going at the moment in talking about the Ukraine. So this interconnection that he challenges us into and brings us into, to me, is very, very important. We saw it particularly in his 2017 document, Politics, a Style of Politics for Peace, bringing nonviolence right into the arena of political peacemaking, advocacy, international cooperation, engagement of civil society. So I think he's been trying to bring us into and show us the steps that he is trying to work out in his own mind of the responses we need to make as Christians to a wide variety of forms of violence in our world today, but to bring to that the third option, Jesus's option of non-violence. I don't know what it's like where everyone else is sitting, but the countries you're in, but I think of the UK now, and we've polarized on the war in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. You either go to war or you do nothing. And we've heard that so many times in the past. And I think what Francis perhaps is pushing us to, and he did it very well, I think, in a recent Angelus message, where he actually said to the, he used the phrase, how do we respond with non-violence? He's putting that question out to us, and we're grappling with that in our work for non-violence. You're grappling with that in your academic work. I think there are a lot of pathways that I hope we'll come back to in this conversation. But I think what's important is that Francis is now taking us into a third direction, showing us that it's legitimate, that it's important, that it has to do with our tradition and gospel values, and that it can actually perhaps take us to a point where, what he says in Fratelli Tutti, we're living in a time of dark clouds over a closed world. Gosh, that's definitely the world we're in at the moment, dark clouds over a closed world. I think he's trying to take us beyond that so that we're not left in that darkness.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think maybe, well, first of all, I should say, would anyone else like to intervene at this point and offer your own comments? Or I could turn alternatively. I was kind of thinking of Pavlo and Rashied first because you come from different contexts. So to get more of a global perspective.
Yes, if I may, Lisa. So for us, in a way, academic discussions, on Laudato Si and the legitimacy of the use of force have a very concrete parallel in the decisions that are being discussed for Ukraine, to arm Ukraine, not to arm Ukraine. And I think in both cases, at least I find difficult to find one line coming from the Holy See. Yes, in Fratelli Tutti, on the one hand, the Pope says that no more war. Yes, that in the context of nuclear power, in the context of biological weapons, any war can be illegitimate, and yet he says that to love your oppressor means to stop him oppressing you. And that's a way in which you strip him of power, Pope Francis says. And I can't interpret this as a right to self-defense. And also very interestingly, Francis interprets this passage from Matthew. Yes, I have not come to bring peace but a sword, by saying then when the conflict comes, yes, you need to endure it. So you have this, I think, a duality or dialectics of two perspectives. And I think with Ukrainian case, we can witness something very similar. That's where Pope Francis also seems to be contrary to sending arms to Ukraine, seems to be advocating the rejection of use of any force. And the Secretary of State, Cardinal Parolin, Cardinal Archbishop Gallagher say that Ukraine has a right to protect its borders, its territory, its sovereignty. And to speak very frankly, it's also a motive of pain and a bit of confusion for the Catholic hierarchy and laity in Ukraine, who really would prefer to have more clear answers and are not getting that.
Well, what does that mean? So like just turning to your own situation or sticking with that for a second, as we were getting ready to go on this morning, you mentioned a lot of other activities that you had coming up today and in the coming weeks. And so my question is, when you do turn to your own situation and the dilemmas that you're facing, and you work ecumenically, not just with Catholics, how is this playing out? Or what kinds of, I don't know, concrete struggles or positions or viewpoints are you hearing coming from religious representatives or religious communities in Ukraine?
Thank you. I think that past conclusion I can share is that the war has changed the way we look at peace building, reconciliation. I was reading a document by the All Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations, which is a major body which unites major Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant churches, but also Jews and Muslims in Ukraine. And in 2017, then they issued a document on peace building, reconciliation. And it was already, Ukraine was fighting its war in Donbass.
Mm-hmm.
So, and there they said, for example, that we can speak about forgiveness and peace building even before the conflict would end. Today, nobody would, speak in those terms. So it means that the war puts you in a situation I wouldn't say that it's emotional situation, but it's you live with the totality, of your mind and heart, and it provokes different responses.
Yeah.
The second point, the ecumenical side of it, I think there is a challenge in front of our churches to be example of peace building and reconciliation. And sometimes we struggle with this. So you can see, for example, the tensions between the Orthodox jurisdictions in Ukraine, which have become particularly acute since the war has begun. And you ask yourself, are we really giving as churches an example of reconciliation, which then so-called secular world can follow? So I think it's really a huge challenge for us. We have been focused perhaps too much as Catholics also on issues of sexual ethics, bioethics, and the question of peace building became sort of secondary one. So now I think we are trying to gather forces and to be able to learn and to find our answers for the situation we are living.
So I'm going to mention something, but bracket it for now. And it's that I know, or I think that Pat Gaffney was also recently part of a religious delegation to Ukraine. Is that right? You were not? Well, there was one. Anyway, I saw that you had a posting on it at some point. Anyway, so something we could go back to would be what kinds of concrete peace building initiatives are possible. And I hear what you're saying about the resistance and the lack of, all the religious denominations necessarily getting on board with that at the concrete level. But I'm aware that we have two other panelists, and I'd like to turn to them before we elaborate more on that and give them a chance. So Dr. Omar, could you possibly share your own perspective? So of course you go outside of Christianity and you have a Muslim perspective as well as one from different continents. Right now you're sitting in Africa, South Africa. So please share with us your insights.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. Well, it's afternoon here in South Africa. Thank you for inviting me to this discussion. It's I think very important, and I value the fact that you have invited me, because the world looks very different from the perspective of what we call the global South. And it's so important for people in the Northern Hemisphere to be able, if we are really sincere about peace building, about global humanity and the condition, that we also think about the millions and millions of people living in the global South. So what is the situation? The situation is, and this is I thank you that you mentioned, Lisa, that Pope Francis is not looking only at violence from the point of view of war. He's looking at violence in a far more comprehensive sense. In peace studies, we call it structural violence. It's a more insidious kind of violence that, and during the COVID-19 pandemic, right? This structural violence was clear for all of us to see, right? And the sad thing is that religious people, have missed this message and this lesson that despite the huge inequalities in wealth, which is there in Fratelli Tutti, which the Pope is lamenting about, right? During the pandemic, this huge inequality of wealth has in fact increased. The rich became even richer, right? And, that kind of structural violence causes slow death, malnutrition, and so on. So this is a very important part of the debate, not only even if we restrict it to what's happening in Ukraine now. There is no doubt, I think the vast majority of people in the global South and elsewhere feel empathetically with the suffering of the people of Ukraine, and they condemn unequivocally the Russian, unjust invasion of Ukraine and the right of Ukrainians to defend themselves, right? One of the things, of course, even Catholic theologians and myself as a Muslim peace studies scholar have been wondering is whether we, of course, the Ukrainians have a legitimate right to defend themselves militarily. But was nonviolent means of resistance exhausted? Or did the Ukrainians, just jump to, violent resistance and being armed to the teeth by Western powers? The last point I'd like to mention, and this is, of course, nothing new. Everyone knows about it. But no one, is moved by it, is the duplicity of the global world order that is being seen from the global South. If Ukrainians have the right to defend themselves against Russian invasion, then so do every other oppressed community in the global South, right? And the kind of response that they have been legitimation for their struggles against foreign invasion hasn't received the same kind of support that the Ukrainians have received. And so one of the key things, for example, you've mentioned, and it's not unique to you, Lisa, or anyone else, the question of Palestinians. We cannot mention that. We run away as if we're scared to say that the state of Israel is committing gross violations of human rights. If you criticize the state of Israel, are you there ipso facto anti-Semitic? Is the state of Israel not a human state? It is an angelic state that can commit no atrocities. The killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, a Catholic Christian journalist, just about a month ago, and there's not a single word from the Vatican with regard to that. So I'm just giving you a perspective from the global South that yes, people want to support. In fact, they're supporting the Ukrainians, and they have the legitimate rights. But we're asking Ukrainians as well, if you have any empathy, then you also have to think about, the duplicity of the global world order in which we find ourselves. I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you for your patience with me.
Okay, thanks. So, General Latiff, I know that you are very interested and involved and committed to peace building. Maybe you could offer some reflections also just from your track record, your history, your experience in the US military, but also someone who continues to write and study this. How does this come back and speak to our just war traditions? Like, how would you see that whole outlook maybe being challenged or reestablished, or any thoughts that you may have to share on these general questions that have been raised, and anything else that's come up that you'd like to address.
Well, I think my perspective on this is probably the least informed of the panel, but looking at what the Pope has said and written, I actually don't see the inconsistencies, which may sound a little bit strange, but when I read, the Pope says there is no such thing as a just war. That is not the same thing as saying that just war theory is unimportant. And I come at this from the point of view of a military commander. And just war theory is hugely important to soldiers and militaries. It sort of gives them a framework from which to, create laws of armed conflict and rules of engagement and those kind of things. So I don't find any consistency in what he says. And Pavlo mentioned earlier, what I was going to say is that, the Pope talked about one who suffers injustice must vigorously defend his rights. So I don't believe that the Pope is ruling out violence, although the Pope is not going to embrace violence. But I don't get that he's ruling it out at all. I guess, and to the last point, I think someone said that, did the Ukrainians exhaust all nonviolent possibilities? Frankly, they were being attacked. I'm not sure how you exhaust nonviolent possibilities when you're under violent attack. So that didn't answer your question, I don't think, Lisa, but I was kind of going back to the inconsistencies. I don't see the inconsistencies in the Pope.
Yeah. So this issue that you just mentioned of how Ukraine, for example, would be able to resist violent attack through nonviolent measures when they're under attack. A question like that has been going through my head for a while. And also I've been observing something about myself and others and the way we usually approach peace building. And I think all three of the other panelists could probably say something really useful on this. But it has been striking that the Russian attack on Ukraine just seems so overwhelming and so ruthless. And the ultimate command is not on the ground in Ukraine as well. So therefore, the command structure is from afar, and the combatants in a way are local, but in another way, when we're talking about bombs and different types of technology, which is your specialization, you don't have as much opportunity for face-to-face interaction. And so I've been wondering to myself what peace building efforts would really look like and whether they could be effective, especially remembering that at the beginning of the war, there were, of course, here in the United States, we saw many televised examples and read in many outlets, religious and the New York Times or the Washington Post, of ways in which Ukrainian civilians especially would be confronting Russian troops and sometimes winning some recognition from individual soldiers. But as time went on, the kind of barrage of military force or technological force became so overwhelming that it seemed that was impossible. How are the people in Mariupol supposed to respond to that? So it has raised an issue for me. First of all, just practically, is there a way that could happen, and what does that look like, or what would that look like? But I've also been realizing that for myself, when I think of peace building, I think of something much more face-to-face, which does often occur when conflict is ongoing. But I've been involved with the Catholic Peace Building Network at Notre Dame as a theological advisor. And so I am thinking of individuals I met and actual sites that I visited, like in Colombia or in the Great Lakes region of Africa, where even though conflict was going on, people found a way in local communities to approach combatants face to face, or often it would be the women who would advocate for a zone of peace, say around a school or a community center, and sort of start from the ground up and build more recognition of common humanity and common goals and work for peace in that way. The Catholic bishops, among others, were very involved in that sort of thing in Colombia. But the question I'm having is whether that model is adequate anymore when we look at other situations. We're talking about Ukraine, but it wouldn't be limited to that, where the force is just sort of unrelenting, overwhelming, and there's very difficult to find a way into peace building conversations. So I am just putting that out there. I'm not saying that my viewpoints are correct, but what is the angle that others would have on these? Yeah, Pat.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Lisa. It's really helpful. I think all of us will know that this current crisis hasn't come in a vacuum. We've been moving here since 2014, and probably before that. So I think one of our tasks as peace builders or peacemakers is constantly to have our antenna out there, to be reading the warnings and the signs of the times about what's happening in terms of breakdowns of democracy, militarization of regions, but also to be looking at civil society and what we're doing in building the capacity of civil society. And by that, I'm thinking of the truth tellers, the journalists. I'm thinking of the women's networks who have such amazing influence globally. I'm thinking about the trade unionists, all those people who have capacity to articulate different challenging messages, the people who can challenge within their domestic and home contexts, the kind of culture that's evolving in societies if it's heading into violence. The educators who are trying to challenge xenophobia, racism, challenges to democracy, and empower young people to be better able to respond and act in their societies. And the churches and the faith communities who, we've heard are so well placed because they are deeply embedded in societies and have the capacity to mobilize and to communicate. And as Pavlo said, to try and communicate a very difficult alternative message sometimes. So I think, I don't mean to dismiss the violence at the moment that Ukraine is experiencing, but, there's always a history, there's a backstory. How did we get to this point? And there's always a much wider community involved, whether it's Palestine, whether it's East Timor, whether it's Ukraine, Russia, whatever's happening in Europe. There's a much wider community behind the scenes that could be better prepared, that could be ready to respond, ready to act, but in real time, creating a different ground where different decisions can be made. And I think, we do great disservice to peace movements in Russia at the moment if we fail to support the conscientious objectors, if we fail to support the journalists whose papers are being closed down, if we fail to support the journalists who are being imprisoned, the women peace protesters. Part of the story has to be, how is Russia resisting? How is civil society in Russia resisting? And what could we as peace builders be doing to support that? And that's the same, whether it's Palestine, Russia, East Timor, Eritrea, what are we doing to support the peace builders?
Okay, thank you. So Bob, you had another angle you'd like to add.
Well, I think I wanted to add to what Pat was saying. I think Pat was onto something. It has to do with education. There is nothing at all that justifies what Russia has done and the way they've behaved, going all the way back to 2014. But what most Western, at least I know most Western populations don't educate themselves on the history And if you understand Russian history, the history of that whole region, not just Russian, but you can kind of get a sense of they were signaling this for quite a number of years, and we just weren't listening, I don't think. So the expansion of NATO, which was never, there was never a promise not to, but the expansion of NATO really was a thorn in their side, and for valid reasons, possibly. So my point is not that anything justifies what they did, but had we begun thinking a little bit sooner, we might have been able to forestall this kind of violent reaction on the part of the Russians.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Pavlo.
I would like just to make two comments about non-violence. I think Ukraine had a moment of non-violent resistance with Crimea. If you remember, when in 2014, Russia has occupied Crimea, there was, I think, a consensus internationally and within Ukraine that we don't want to provoke Russia escalating the war. So I think no bullet, or maybe one bullet, one person was killed during all the time, but Ukrainians wouldn't resist. Ukrainian military wouldn't resist. They would, go around and chant songs. And this was a peaceful, nonviolent resistance that has failed. And afterwards, Ukrainians started resisting in Donbass and Luhansk. So I think we tried it and it didn't work. And if you see what has happened in Crimea afterwards, for example, a very resistant community in Crimea was that of Crimean Tartars, a Muslim community, and their leaders have been outlawed, put in jail, etc. So it's not easily to resist in a situation where you have a huge authoritarian state, which, unlaws, as they did today, even the word war, because they say that what is going on in Ukraine is not war. Ukraine has never been invaded, etc. So it's not, I have all confidence and trust in non-violence, and I think we should encourage it in Russia. We should encourage it in occupied territories where you don't have other means, but I don't see how you can, peacefully resist to this invasion. And the second commentary about was what Robert was saying about NATO and Russia. I know a little bit Russia. I spent some of my studies there. I taught at several programs. Now, my feeling is that Russian population in its majority hasn't been anti-Western. They became a hostage of authoritarian regime, which has been brainwashing them. And after 1-2 decades, they really start thinking as regime does. I don't really think that they felt NATO as a threat. You can see today with Finland and Sweden, yes, are negotiating their entrance to NATO, and government says, well, we are not really afraid of that. We don't perceive this as a challenge. So I think there is a lot of domestic, Russian domestic narratives that are being produced and sold to the rest of the world. And I see also the tragedy that this narrative is being bought around the world, and that majority world often reads this conflict as, in a way, American imperialism versus Russian imperialism. And they say, oh, we don't have, our stake there. And I think it's very unfortunate, and it, in a way, denies Ukrainian agency and doesn't see what Ukrainian people are thirsty for, just to live in peace and freedom and dignity. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rashied.
Thank you, Pavlo. I would like to respond to you. I really agree with you, and I can empathize with you fully when you're saying that Ukrainians have tried nonviolence, because this is in the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. This is exactly what happened. In fact, most people, this is my point. We can empathize with you, that you have not willy-nilly just gone to violent resistance, but we just hope that in your heart of hearts, you can find a similar kind of empathy for other oppressed people who are fighting, like Palestinians, or like people in Iraq when the United States invaded their country, right? So this is the first point. I agree with you, but just the kind, if it's true in Ukraine, it is true elsewhere that nonviolence is not easy against a superpower with so much of weapons and aggression. The second point I'd like to make is, I agree with you. It's not fair just to, and this is from the global South, to look at the war in Ukraine as a fight between imperialism, between Russian imperialism versus US imperialism, because Ukrainians also have agency, right? Now, again, I want you to empathize. I agree with you fully, but there is no doubt that the United States also has committed grave violations of human rights. In Iraq, for example, Pope John Paul II, the late John, told George W. Bush himself when he visited shortly before the war, it is an unjust war. It's an immoral war. Yet the United States killed thousands upon thousands of Iraqis, right? George W. Bush and Tony Blair have been taken to the International Criminal Court, and they're free. I mean, just recently, Blair was given, some great honor in Britain. So if you're looking at from the point of view of people in the global South, is it unfair for us to look at the world in this way, that it's an unjust world, and that, there's only sympathy for Ukraine, but other places will have the similar kind of crisis? And so then the question arises for us, does it mean that Black lives, people who are not white-skinned, their lives matter less? What then? I want to ask everyone on the panel, does it mean about our speaking about peace building? If we don't want to address this, if we find what I'm saying uncomfortable, we run away from it, we speak, what does it mean for our own conscience as human beings, as people of faith, of religious people? Thank you for your patience.
Yeah, thank you. So I will throw in something on that. It's what I'm actually doing is going to one of the questions that I had suggested to all you people earlier. That's the last question, and it has to do really with peace building in relation to the whole global order, and especially the economic order, which I think is what you're really getting at, right? And so first of all, I think it's good for us all to hear this message, because I think we do tend to get distracted by particular conflicts and then we turn away from all of the larger global dynamics that have made that conflict possible in the first place, and how people, especially as you say, the superpowers, the economic superpowers, not just the military superpowers, who are not participating directly in the conflict, are still partly responsible, or maybe even majorly responsible. But the thing that I want to point out, this is a difficulty in a way, is that we're always talking, number one, we're always talking to a selective audience. So we are now, you, Rashied, just spoke to 4 other people who are panelists on peace building and the future of war in a conference that's being sponsored by the Catholic Peacebuilding Network. So of course, all of the people to whom you're speaking are already aware of and sympathetic to the things that you just said. And that leads us, so yes, we need to have our attention focused more on what you just said, but it's not as though we would be inimical to the basic message. We've probably written the same thing in our various publications, or spoken or read, with our classes on these same issues. So the one problem that we have is that superpowers in every other political community is internally diverse. And so you have some people in the United States trying to advocate in the directions that you suggest. Certainly Israel-Palestine is a very live political discussion in the United States. It would not be the case that everyone unquestioningly supports the situation of the Palestinians as it is now, de facto. I don't mean doesn't support their political goals, but not everyone supports the situation that they're in. But the problem is political change and conversion. So having a conference like this, or doing the teaching that we do, or the practical activist work that Pat does, those are all movements in that direction. But we've got a huge dilemma. It's not as though the United States and all the people in the United States have one point of view. And you are here frequently yourself, so you understand some of the political dynamics and the difficulties that we have. So, I mean, maybe I guess the only other person here who is an American is Bob. So if you have any, and of course you're working across many different sectors, I would say, more so than some of the rest of us. So you come into contact maybe with greater variety of political points of view. I don't know. But could you speak to that at all?
Well, I'm not precisely sure what it is you want me to speak to. You started talking about economics and the world economic situation.
Yeah.
One of the things that I focus a lot on in my writing and teaching is the global arms industry. Mm-hmm. And I think the global arms industry has a lot to answer for when it comes to global instability. I mean, if you watch the SIPRI numbers, the last year, I think, was the largest global arms budget ever. And then in countries like the United States and China and Russia they're selling arms at an enormous rate. And the problem is that a lot of these smaller countries, the lesser developed nations, are the ones who buy them at great cost to the well-being of their populations. And so, I think there's a problem there, and it's a problem that I believe bears a global movement, or whatever you want to call it. I don't know how one would create such a movement, but it's a very serious problem, and it's a problem that's been recognized throughout history. It's just when you have large stocks of arms, there's a tendency to want to use those. And so it creates not only economic instability, but military instability.
Yeah. I mean, that the effect of the arms race on the poor is something that, or on the majority of the world's populations, we don't have to identify them as the poor, was something that was already identified by Pope John the 23rd in Pacem in Terris. And Pope Francis brought this up again, in fact, in a message that is for the World Day of the Poor next November, but which was already released, still making the exact same point like half a century later. So I think that's true. And I'm sorry if my own sort of line of questioning or reflections was too diffuse, but what I was really trying to target there are these global structural problems, like what you just mentioned, which is also an economic problem, right? That's the root of it. That's the root of most of this, as far as I can see. But within the nations that are most responsible, there's also a great diversity of perspective. And so we here and most of our constituency today are against the things that you and Rashied are describing, but we have a big political dilemma in terms of how to move the country as a whole, which is very influential in what you and Rashied are calling the wrong direction. How to move it in a different direction. So identifying the problem is one thing, but really action on it is a big challenge. One that we all face here in the US on a day-to-day basis. So.
I'll just answer that. One of the other things that I focus a lot on is education. And someone mentioned it earlier, I think it might've been Pat. That education really is highly correlated with xenophobia and nationalism and all of those things. And to the extent that we can affect our education system, it's a long-term change, but I think that would go a long way toward helping.
Mm-hmm. Pat, I don't know if you have anything.
I just wanted to make a comment. I'm sure the people of Ukraine would be horrified to realize that their suffering is being used by many of the powerful countries in the world to boost and increase national budgets and the arms race and the arms industry. And just our own Prime Minister this morning talking not in sorrow, but in pride, that this war is going to be a long haul. Now, I find that shameful, that a world leader of a country like ours is almost glorifying in the possibilities that this war is going to bring to our own national defense industry. So I think you're quite right, tackling the whole global arms trade has to be an international project. Working on nuclear disarmament has to be an international project. And it's great that the states who've already signed up to the nuclear weapon ban treaty are meeting at the moment in Vienna. So another strand of our work for nonviolence is all the advocacy and campaigning that we have to be persistent about in challenging the logic and the morality of putting all our defense thinking into a military context. And that's what all of our countries are doing. And I'm sure the people of Ukraine do not want that to be the case.
Yeah. Well, Pavlo, I feel that you should have the opportunity to reply on the behalf of the people of Ukraine, or to those in your collegial group, at least.
Yes, thank you, Lisa. I'm not sure that I can reply on behalf of Ukrainians, but at least, yes. One thing I would like to share is that I agree with what Rashied said earlier on, that the world has shown itself in such a solidarity to Ukraine that perhaps other conflicts or nations didn't attract such an attention. And when I speak to my fellow Ukrainians, I say that this solidarity of the world, or of the Western world, is an undeserved gift, you know, and that it should teach us also to be in solidarity with what is going on in other countries. Majority of Ukrainians are Orthodox or Eastern Catholics. There is an important Muslim minority. And the question I'm asking, have we been as helpful to the people in Palestine, in Lebanon, Ethiopia, or in India? So I think the lesson also from Laudato Si, Fratelli Tutti, is that there is interconnectedness. Yes, and we need to see Ukrainian case not only, I would say, egoistically as Ukrainians, but also see through what effects it's going to produce, yes, in Africa, in Asia, in terms of food, but also in questions of which, yes, Pat and Robert were raising, of increase of weapon production and militarization of the world. And here Ukraine will be the loser. As far as nuclear non-proliferation is concerned, and I know that many of you and Jerry are doing a lot for that sake, I would just mention that Ukraine, yes, signed a Budapest Memorandum in 1994, and it had one of the biggest nuclear arsenals in the world, which it had completely surrendered and became a non-nuclear country. Now, if Ukraine is left alone in this mess, I wonder what, you know, precedent it will create to other countries that might be interested in joining, you know, nuclear non-proliferation. If you surrender your nuclear weapons and then once attacked, nobody protects you, that's, you don't want, you know, to remain without nuclear weapons. So I think that the war in Ukraine is also opening this side. and it certainly will have repercussions on other countries. And the way the world approach this issue will have also possibly detrimental effects on the nuclear non-proliferation. So that's not easy to look at Ukrainian case in its interconnectedness to the problems of the world as such, especially when you are Ukrainian. Yes, you tend to be focused on your own people because it's your friends that are being shot and killed and your parents who need to leave, the country. But I think it's a vision that we need to cherish, and that's, I think, a beautiful also occasion to discuss this interconnectedness.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I don't know if anyone else would like to address that. We've now started off into a discussion of nuclear weapons, and that's certainly important. I see Rashied has his hand up, so we'll go to you first. But this is another very important topic in its own right, of course. So
yeah, I just want to say a few words about the nuclear thing. I think this is again where we can applaud Fratelli Tutti, the encyclical, because it comes out, against the reason why it's questioning whether just war theory is still valid in the contemporary times is because of the kinds of weapons that we have available, and nuclear weapons. Can we then fight an ethical war with these kinds of weapons of mass destruction? I think that's the key question that Fratelli Tutti is posing to just war theory. And I think it's very inspirational. It's something that we need to look at. The two things I want to make. Again, I'm jumping somewhere else, but it's very useful. You know that South Africa during the apartheid era, it also had nuclear weapons, right? During the racist apartheid white regime, they had nuclear weapons, and the world turned away. But when Mandela came into power in 1994, Pavlo, South Africa also, got rid of its nuclear weapons. And in fact, the international nuclear, from the UN send observers to check whether, we have really dismantled our nuclear powers, because they don't trust a black man with a nuclear bomb. So the question again about duplicity, right? In terms of the nuclear non-proliferation. What about NATO? Of course, it's not an ideal time now to ask this question when we have the war, of the Russian invasion. But let's take before the Russians invaded Ukraine. Should we not have been, as peace builders, campaigning for NATO, to denuclearize, or even not expand but diminish, because it's a war machine, right? And then the last point I'd like to make is, again, coming back to the question that behind a lot of this is that we need to broaden our understanding of violence, not only war, but the comprehensive view of war from which we started off. And we did discuss the military-industrial complex, that war is not just taking place, but because people are benefiting, making arms and benefiting from it. Then we come back to a question about the exploitation of minerals, of coltan in Africa, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Huge amounts of people millions have been killed. The war is ongoing. And there is not this amount of attention given to the war in in Central Africa. And then I therefore want to conclude with a wonderful, and as a Muslim, I'm inspired by Fratelli Tutti, but I'm not reading it in a narrow sense, just about a just war theory, but in the broader context of what, are the underlying causes, the root causes of war. And I want to quote you from paragraph 186 of Fratelli Tutti. And I quote, it says, "It is an act of charity to assist someone who is suffering, but it is also an act of charity, even if we do not know that person, to work to transform and to change the social system, the social situation that caused the suffering in the first place," unquote. What a marvelous quotation. And if we as peace builders were to take that seriously, we can come to at least one of the root causes of war and violence. Thank you again for your patience.
No, thank you. Those are great comments. I'd like to maybe actually talk about the extractive industries and mining and peace building, but we started down the path of nuclear weapons. So if we could just bracket that and spend a bit more time on the nuclear arms race, the possibility of nuclear diminishment, and possibly also other technologies that are being developed that probably deserve more attention than the public usually gives them. So Pat, you were just talking a little bit ago about nuclear arms negotiations, and what do you see going on presently, and what are your hopes, or what do you think is the possibility for a good outcome?
Well, just at this moment, I mentioned that the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which came into force, I think, in 2020, they're having the first states meeting at this moment in Vienna. And although still the nuclear states themselves have not committed to this treaty, I think it's interesting that the majority of countries who are behind it are, just as Rashied said, the global south, the people in the global south who are impacted by investment in nuclear weapons and the resources that they consume. They're directly impacted by those. So I think a key role that we have to play, those of us who are part of those nuclear families, those countries that are nuclear families, is to persistently push our governments and our churches to challenge, the legality and the morality of this nuclear umbrella. I think the Pope Francis has been very clear on this, and even moving us, I think, into questioning the validity and the right of deterrence, living with that kind of fear and that structure. The church took a leading role in being one of the first to sign and ratify that treaty. I think international law, treaties like this are very important, not just in their own right around the specific issue, but they're important in the framework of international law that they are a part of. And our world desperately needs to see a deeper commitment and upholding of international law. And we really have to bring our own countries to that accountable table of their responsibilities within the framework of international law. If we lose that, we will be in very dark times. Mm-hmm. So that's to start that bit of the conversation.
Okay. Bob, how about you? Do you have any thoughts on that? You're our biggest technology expert on the panel today.
Well, I have lots of thoughts. I'm a former nuclear weapons commander, so I've dealt with nuclear weapons pretty much all my life. So again, I don't see any inconsistencies in any of it. I think that the church is absolutely right to be totally against nuclear weapons. On the other hand, I consider myself a realist, and I think the idea of a global zero in nuclear weapons, while it's a wonderful idea, is one that will never happen. These things cannot be uninvented. So I think pragmatically, the best we can hope for is to try to continue to reduce the numbers. But to your question about other technologies, I forget who said it, might have been Rashied. Just war theory, I think, breaks down when it comes to nuclear weapons. They're just not. They're not weapons. They're not war fighting devices. They're civilization-ending devices. And same thing with chemical and biological weapons. They're inhumane. My thinking is that the value of just war theory comes into play more in actually fighting a war rather than trying to destroy a civilization. In terms of new technologies, the ones that are of most concern to me in my writing really center around artificial intelligence and autonomous systems. And throughout the military, not just in individual weapons, but in decision making. Probably that's the one that concerns me the most. Hypersonic weapons are these, super duper fast missiles. I think they have no tactical value, but what they do is they create an enormous amount of instability, which very much like the American Star Wars system really set off an arms race, 40 years ago that's ongoing. And that really brings me all the way back to what I was saying earlier about global arms budgets. So anyway, a short answer to your question, really autonomous systems and artificial intelligence are probably the newest version of weapons that concern me.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, I know this is something you've given some thought to, and it's the question of whether existence of technologies create a drive, to use those technologies because they're available. That's something that people in the US have been afraid of in terms of Russia as a nuclear power in Ukraine. If they have nuclear weapons, will they be tempted to use those if other resources fail, or if some reason they think that would be effective as a strategy? But also, and this goes more to what you were just saying about the development of AI and other kinds of systems, does the existence of technology also lead to a drive or create a drive to keep improving on that technology, and therefore to create more and more technologies? So technology proliferates because technology exists, or use of technologies occurs because technologies exist. Or are both of those things true? Or how do you see that problem?
You've hit upon really the thing that I probably am most concerned about, and that is that at least we in the United States, in America, and maybe the other Western countries, we are addicted to technology, and we have throughout our history, particularly in America, depended on technology to fight our wars for us. And so I think the answer to your question is yes. Russia and Ukraine has trotted out a number of their brand new weapons, which turns out don't work all that well. America, we did it in the first Desert War, and in the last one, used our new weapons. And I think historically, if you look back, all the way back to the 1700s, Kant and others wrote about the presence of weapons inviting their use. And so a long answer to a very short question. I think absolutely we are just seduced by really cool weapons, for lack of a better term. And it's a problem.
Yeah. Let me just shift the focus a little bit back to something that was mentioned earlier. And this, of course, is not to prevent anyone else from raising further issues. I'll give you a chance to do that. But the reality of conflict around mineral extraction was already raised as a great problem on the whole peacebuilding, horizon. And in fact, Jerry Powers and Cesar Montevecchio just published a book, an edited book on this very topic, the relation between mining and violence, or more positively stated, the extractive industry and peace building. So that's one issue, if anyone would like to speak to that directly. But I have really a bigger question, I guess, and it really came into focus for me when I read an article in Foreign Affairs like maybe a month ago that was arguing that in Africa, but my question is whether this is a general problem, not just in Africa, we've gotten to a point, especially obvious with the extractive industry, where the maintaining of violence and sort of social and political disarray becomes an end in itself, because the people who are provoking the disarray are benefiting from those circumstances essentially to gain economic resources, which is what happens through mining. So it goes back to the same economic issue. And the article pointed out that one of the big changes in the nature of conflict today is that in the past, those provoking conflict had political goals, even idealistic goals, but at least group-oriented goals. So they wanted to replace a regime and accomplish a different sort of political order that would favor the political goals that they have. And in the present case, that's no longer true, which makes it more difficult to engage in peace building. It also is a radical change in the nature of conflict. Does this mean, is this a sign, again, that conflict is going away from nation states, or are nation states also engaged in the same thing? I mean, the prospect that conflict is an end in itself in some circumstances, because it permits appropriation of economic benefits, it made a light go on for me. And I saw many ways in which that could be true. So I don't know if others have comments on this, experience with this.
I don't have a comment, but I would add to your question, or maybe modify it.
Mm-hmm.
That before it was nation states, and now you say, now it's more economic. But wouldn't it also be true that even before, all the nation state was a middleman, and they were trying to achieve economic benefit as well?
Oh, definitely. Okay. I definitely think that's true. But I also think that, what we see, for example, in some of the countries in Africa that are the sites of unethical and exploitative resource extraction, not limited to Africa, but just to take that, would be sub-state actors or transnational actors or groups within the boundaries of a nation state. So it really diversifies, almost democratizes in a way, the power and the motivation and the rewards for instigating and maintaining a state of political disarray and violence. Rashied.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think this is an important one. I don't think, though, that it's a new phenomenon. It has become more exacerbated. For example, when we look at the colonial wars in Africa, we have a simple thing, 3 G's: gold, glory, and God, right? So the glory was the power, but the gold, which was the extraction, was an important part, right from the and that's why if you say, why is this rich continent so poor? Because there's a wonderful Walter Rodney wrote a book called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, and it continues. Now, I want to go to the question specifically. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, the DRC, is a case study in what you just indicated. I mean, it's a very rich, mineral-rich country. It has a conflict that no one can really understand and get their head around it, but it has to do with this thing that's happening underneath, which is the extraction of minerals, and especially something called coltan. Coltan is what each one of us uses in our computers, in cell phones. It's a very important mineral. And so I would want to say that, yes, of course, many global companies who are involved in this are, want to keep the conflict going so that the extraction can continue. And of course, they have agency from within the DRC, people within the DRC, so it's not merely outsiders coming in, but a kind of symbiotic relationship between these outside companies and individuals within the country who have agency and who are benefiting, but then also, to complicate it, the regional actors. So both Uganda and especially Rwanda, this wonderful example that we have of democracy in Africa, is deeply implicated in the mineral extraction in the DRC, and in fact, continuing to keep the areas around its border, as a kind of a conflict zone in order to mask the extraction. So I would really, say that if people could study the DRC, it would be a wonderful example of exactly what you were explaining. Of course, again, I want to say that right whilst we are speaking, there's a war carrying on in the DRC. It's been carrying on for a long, long time, and it doesn't get the same kind of focus that the war in Ukraine or elsewhere is getting. And the question should be asked why.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. So in a few minutes, like 3 minutes, we're going to start taking questions from the audience or from the participants that have signed up. But I just want to maybe offer all of you the opportunity to raise any other issues or to develop an issue further that's come up that you might think needs a bit more attention than we've given it. Is there anything going through your head that you feel like you wanted to say, but you didn't? You'll also get a chance to sum up at the end, but just following on this. Pavlo.
Just to develop this idea which Yulisa expressed on democratization of violence, I was thinking about that in a way modern world has been defined as nation states getting monopoly on violence. Yes, as different from what was there in the past. Yes, when armies were personal, when church would have their armies, etc. And I think today we were talking about, yes, the violence for resources, and I'm thinking of military companies, for example, that Russia has been using in Ukraine, but also in Syria, in Central African Republic, which would fight for resources, but not in the name of the nation state, or at least not formally. And I'm wondering whether it's also something that is going to affect more and more our world, nation state losing, this grip because war is so unpopular. And other actors will be coming in, yes, and it will probably also might be an aspect of this new world order that we are looking for. We try to define or in a way make it more humane.
Okay, thank you. That's a good thought. Maybe more positive thought. Anyone else? We have, well, actually it's 10:20. So let me turn to some of the questions, which Jerry Powers is kindly organizing for me over here. So there's a question that I am personally interested in that Jerry has put up over here. I kind of lost it there. There it is. Okay, so there's a number of questions about the negative role of social media and the rise of extremism, and therefore the need to focus on peace education. So Pat has gotten to that a bit. It can certainly stand more development, but how is this social media presence of extremist ideologies, what are effective ways to really combat that? Maybe our traditional modes of education aren't sufficient. But I'm also thinking of something that's related to that, and that is the powerful effect of so-called fake news. And we see in Russia right now, but also North Korea, where there's actually state control of the reality, if you will, that a population is exposed to. But that intersects with the social media question, because there are some people who self-segregate into environments that are particularly mediated online, in which fake news also controls, or false information, prejudicial misinterpretations and outright falsehoods control what they perceive reality to be. So comments from anyone? I don't know if that's as much of a problem, say in South Africa or in Ukraine. It's obviously related to Ukraine because it's happening in Russia, and it bears on the technology question that Bob is an expert on, and then the sort of activism that Pat is engaged with.
Well, I'll just step up here and maybe just throw out this very, very provocative answer, and say that we in say liberal countries are victims of our own system, and that we have free and open, not controlled by the government. So pretty much on the internet, anything goes. In some other countries, that's not the case, which kind of begs the question of whether or not we need more control over our own. Second, separate point would be, this is an area where artificial intelligence could play a big role in trying to detect and counter the fake news. And I guess the third would be a sort of a national effort to counter fake news, which is goes against our grain as a free liberal society. But at least their thoughts.
How could artificial intelligence counter fake news? Be more specific. So for instance, with the Ukraine war going on, I keep wondering, is there any way to penetrate the Russian system of control? So it's like using technology in an adversarial way against an opponent, not to attack human life directly or even, structural violence, but rather to attack the information system that is controlling a political outlook.
Well, then you start getting into the deep concepts of cyber warfare and things that are going on behind the scenes. Getting into the Russian or anybody else's system is something probably we don't talk about. What I was thinking in terms of AI is great at doing sentiment analysis and language processing. So it can pretty easily find bots and things that are fake and do fact checking and those kind of things, and very quickly. And then of course you could use AI to create counter narratives even.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Okay, Pavlo.
Yes, I think that it's better to have fake news than to have censorship, and of course both are problematic. But what I wanted to add, and I think it has been very much perceived by people on our side, is a little bit of relativism in judging what is going on. And when Robert said that we became victims of our own Western worldview, Russia is saying, "Oh, Americans did this. Why can't we do this? The Westerners recognized Kosovo. Why cannot we, take Crimea?" And even Pope Francis in Fratelli Tutti, among the causes why he thinks that just war is problematic, he says that, because today every war is being preached as defensive. Yes. So in a way, this principle that, you can't find actually the truth about the conflict becomes a reason to say, well, no war should be allowed because everybody says that they are defending themselves. So I think it's almost being brought on the ontological level, the fake news and this moral relativism. So it's really, really a problem.
Yeah. I'm realizing here, I was thinking we had more time than we do, but our time is drawing to a close. And I do believe you've all expressed yourself marvelously, but I'm just going to go back around and see if people have a closing statement that you would like to make. So Pat, I'll start with you.
Thank you. Well, I suppose I would like to go away feeling that we are a little bit better at understanding that nonviolence is taking seriously the range of violent actions in our world today, that it is about preventing, it is about interrupting violence, it is about protecting the vulnerable people in our world and our earth. It's not about standing back and letting it happen. And I feel particularly challenged by a phrase that Pavlo used very early on in the presentation, that in talking about the gospel call to nonviolence, to forgiveness, and to looking at our enemies in different ways and embracing them, that we're all challenged to that example. And I realized I'm challenged in a more comfortable place today, and Pavlo is challenged in a far less comfortable place.
Yeah, thank you. Pavlo.
There is an Ignatian principle, yes, not to take decisions when about your personal life when you are in a moment of crisis. Yes, and I don't know to what extent we have been challenged by the war in Ukraine. We, as Ukrainians, in one way, and I think academic, ecclesial, interreligious community in different way. I don't know whether we will be able to come out with good decisions. But my hope is that while we are looking to find answers, while we are looking maybe for better times to find good answers, that Ukraine is not left alone, to be destroyed and occupied.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your discussion.
Thank you. And Bob, I'll let you go next, and we'll wind up with a voice from the Global South and a different religious tradition. So Bob.
Lisa, you've given me an opportunity to say most of what it is I wanted to say already. I guess I'll just end with, I do hope that people who are against war and against violence can get a stronger voice. They typically don't have the strong voice and the strong platform that they need. So hopefully this will be it.
Thank you. And with that, we will appropriately turn to Rashied Omar.
Thank you very much. I, as a Muslim, I am very inspired by Pope Francis' encyclical Fratelli Tutti. I think it addresses, I think we read the whole thing, and of course, encyclicals are not easy. One has to read it all the time, but I think it's a really a wonderful witness to our world and challenging us in many, many ways. I want to say from the Global South then, that we condemn unequivocally the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But as global citizens, we can hold together at the same time condemning Russian invasion of Ukraine, also calling out the callous and duplicitous actions of the United States and the NATO allies. So we can hold these two things together while condemning the Russians, but at the same time telling the NATO and US allies that they should do better and learn the lessons from this. And then finally, I want to conclude with a wonderful example that I have heard often in the from Global South, is that despite the fact that we are suffering the duplicity and hypocrisy of the global world order, there was a wonderful North African anti-colonial activist called Omar Mukhtar, the Lion of the Desert, and he fought vicious Italian colonialism. And so some of these men, they caught some Italian soldiers and they brought them to them, and they said to Omar Mukhtar, let us kill them. And he said no. And they said, yes, let us kill them the way they kill us. And he said, they are not our teachers. So in the Global South, despite the hypocrisy, despite the duplicity, we are struggling to keep our humanity, not to become dehumanized by legitimating Russian imperialism against the suffering people of Ukraine. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all of you. This has been a great discussion. Everyone was passionate. You have a lot of experience. You brought it for our benefit. And I think something that Rashied said is a good takeaway lesson. We need to learn the right lessons and we need to do better. So with renewed conviction and commitment, I hope we'll all go out and do that. Thank you for everything that you've brought today. And with that, I do think that we are at the end of our session. So thank you.
And thank you, Lisa, for moderation. Thank you.